This is a reading of The Circulation of Elites by Vilfredo Pareto. It was originally published in Pareto's book, The Mind and Society. It was published in English by Arthur Livingston and translated by Andrew Bongiorno and Arthur Livingston. My name is Didymus. The Circulation of Elites by Vilfredo Pareto. Social elites and their circulation. Suppose we begin by giving a theoretical definition of the thing we are dealing with, making it as exact as possible, and then go on to see what practical considerations we can replace it with to get a first approximation. Let us for the moment completely disregard considerations as to the good or bad, useful or harmful, praiseworthy or reprehensible character of the various traits in individuals, and confine ourselves to degrees, to whether, in other words, the trait in a given case be slight, average, intense, or more exactly, to the index that may be assigned to each individual with reference to the degree or intensity in him of the trait in question. Let us assume that in every branch of human activity, each individual is given an index, which stands as a sign of his capacity, very much the way grades are given in the various subjects and examinations in school. The highest type of lawyer, for instance, will be given 10. The man who does not get a client will be given 1, reserving 0 for the man who is an out-and-out idiot. To the man who has made his millions, honestly or dishonestly as the case may be, we will give 10. To the man who has earned his thousands, we will give 6. To such as can manage to keep out of the poorhouse, 1, keeping 0 for those who get in. To the woman in politics, such as the Aspasia of Pericles, the Maintenon of Louis XIV, the Pompadour of Louis XV, who has managed to infatuate a man of power and play a part in the man's career, we shall give some higher number, such as 8 or 9. To the strumpet who merely satisfies the senses of such a man and exerts no influence on public affairs, we shall give 0. To a clever rascal who knows how to fool people and still keep clear of the penitentiary, we shall give 8, 9, or 10, according to the number of geese he has plucked and the amount of money he has been able to get out of them. To the sneak thief, who snatches a piece of silver from the restaurant table and runs away into the arms of a policeman, we shall give 1. To a poet like Carducci, we shall give an 8 or 9 according to our tastes. To a scribbler who puts people to rout with his sonnets, we shall give 0. For chess players we can get very precise indices, noting what matches and how many they have won, and so on for all the branches of human activity. We are speaking, remember, of an actual, not a potential state. If, at an English examination, a pupil says, "I could know English very well if I chose to. I do not know any because I have never seen fit to learn," the examiner replies, "I am not interested in your alibi. The grade for what you know is 0. If, similarly, someone says, "So-and-so does not steal, not because he couldn't, but because he is a gentleman," we reply, "Very well, we admire him for his self-control, but his grade as a thief is 0. There are people who worship Napoleon Bonaparte as a god. There are people who hate him as the lowest of criminals. Which are right? We do not choose to solve that question in connection with quite a different matter. Whether Napoleon was a good man or a bad man, he was certainly not an idiot, nor a man of little account, as millions of others are. He had exceptional qualities, and that is enough for us to give him a high ranking, though without prejudice of any sort to questions that might be raised as to the ethics of his qualities or their social utility. In short, we are here, as usual, resorting to scientific analysis, which distinguishes one problem from another and studies each one separately. As usual, again, we are replacing imperceptible variations in absolutely exact numbers with the sharp variations corresponding to groupings by class. Just as in examinations those who are passed are sharply and arbitrarily distinguished from those who are failed, and just as in the matter of physical age we distinguish children from young people, the young from the aged. So let us make a class of the people who have the highest indices in their branch of activity, and to that class give the name of elite. For the particular investigation with which we are engaged, a study of the social equilibrium, it will help if we further divide that class into two classes: a governing elite, comprising individuals who directly or indirectly play some considerable part in government, and a non-governing elite, comprising all the rest. A chess champion is certainly a member of the elite, but it is no less certain that his merits as a chess player do not open the doors to political influence for him, and hence, unless he has other qualities to win him that distinction, he is not a member of the governing elite. Mistresses of absolute monarchs have oftentimes been members of the elite, either because of their beauty or because of their intellectual endowments, but only a few of them, who have had in addition the particular talents required by politics, have played any part in government. So we get two strata in a population. One, a lower stratum, the non-elite, with whose possible influence on government we are not just here concerned. Then, two, a higher stratum, the elite, which is divided into two: A governing elite, B, a non-governing elite. In the concrete, there are no examinations whereby each person is assigned to his proper place in these various classes. That deficiency is made up for by other means, by various sorts of labels that serve the purpose after a fashion. Such labels are the rule even where there are examinations. The label lawyer is affixed to a man who is supposed to know something about the law and often does, though sometimes, again, he is an ignoramus. So the governing elite contains individuals who wear labels appropriate to political offices of a certain altitude: ministers, senators, deputies, chief justices, generals, colonels, and so on, making the opposite exceptions for those who have found their way into the exalted company without possessing qualities corresponding to the labels they wear. Such exceptions are much more numerous than the exceptions among lawyers, physicians, engineers, millionaires who have made their own money, artists of distinction, and so on. For the reason, among others, that in these latter departments of human activity, the labels are won directly by each individual, whereas in the elite, some of the labels, the label of wealth for instance, are hereditary. In former times there were hereditary labels in the governing elite also. In our day, hardly more than the label of king remains in that status. But if direct inheritance has disappeared, inheritance is still powerful indirectly. And an individual who has inherited a sizable patrimony can easily be named senator in certain countries, or can get himself elected to the parliament by buying votes, or, on occasion, wheedling votes with assurances that he is a Democrat of Democrats, a socialist, an anarchist. Wealth, family, or social connections also help in many other cases to win the label of the elite in general, or of the governing elite in particular, for persons who otherwise hold no claim upon it. In societies where the social unit is the family, the label worn by the head of the family also benefits all other members. In Rome, the man who became emperor generally raised his freedom to the higher class, and oftentimes, in fact, to the governing elite. For that matter, now more, now fewer of the free men taking part in the Roman government possessed qualities good or bad that justified their wearing the labels which they had won through their imperial bounty. In our society, the social unit is the individual. But the place that the individual occupies in society also benefits his wife, his children, his connections, his friends. If all these deviations from type were of little importance, they might be disregarded, as they are virtually disregarded in cases where a diploma is required for the practice of a profession, Everyone knows that there are persons who do not deserve their diplomas, but experience shows that on the whole, such exceptions may be overlooked. One might, further, from certain points of view at least, disregard deviations if they remained more or less constant quantitatively, if it were only a negligible variation in proportions between the total of a class and the people who wear its label without possessing the qualities corresponding. As a matter of fact, the real cases that we have to consider in our societies differ from those two. The deviations are not so few that they can be disregarded. Then again, their number is variable, and the variations give rise to situations having an important bearing on the social equilibrium. We are, therefore, required to make special study of them. Furthermore, the manner in which the various groups in a population intermix has to be considered. In moving from one group to another, an individual generally brings with him certain inclinations, sentiments, attitudes that he has acquired in the group from which he comes, and that circumstance cannot be ignored. To this mixing, in the particular case in which only two groups, the elite and non-elite, are envisaged, the term circulation of elites has been applied, in French, circulation des élites, or in more general terms, class circulation. In conclusion, we must pay special attention, 1. In the case of one single group, to the proportion between the total of the group and the number of individuals who are nominally members of it, but do not possess the qualities requisite for effective membership. And then 2. In the case of various groups, to the ways in which transitions from one group to the other occur, and to the intensity of that movement, that is to say, to the velocity of the circulation. Velocity in circulation has to be considered not only absolutely, but also in relation to the supply of and the demand for certain social elements. A country that is always at peace does not require many soldiers in its governing class, and the production of generals may be over-exuberant as compared with the demand. But when a country is in a state of continuous warfare, many soldiers are necessary, and though production remains at the same level, it may not meet the demand. That, we might note in passing, has been one of the causes for the collapse of many aristocracies. Another example. In a country where there is little industry and little commerce, the supply of individuals possessing in high degree the qualities requisite for those types of activity exceeds the demand. Then industry and commerce develop, and the supply, though remaining the same, no longer meets the demand. We must not confuse the state of law with the state of fact. The latter alone, or almost alone, has a bearing on the social equilibrium. There are many examples of castes that are legally closed, but into which, in the point of fact, newcomers make their way, and often in large numbers. On the other hand, what difference does it make if a caste is legally open, but conditions de facto prevent new accessions to it? If a person who acquires wealth thereby becomes a member of the governing class, but no one gets rich, it is as if the class were closed. And if only a few get rich, it is as if the law erected serious barriers against access to the caste. Something of that sort was observable towards the end of the Roman Empire. People who acquired wealth entered the order of the curials, but only a few individuals made any money. Theoretically, we might examine any number of groups. Practically, we have to confine ourselves to the more important. We shall proceed by successive approximations, starting with the simple and going on to the complex. Higher class and lower class in general. The least we can do is divide society into two strata, a higher stratum, which usually contains the rulers, and a lower stratum, which usually contains the ruled. That fact is so obvious that it has always forced itself even upon the most casual observation, and so for the circulation of individuals between the two strata. Even Plato had an inkling of class circulation and tried to regulate it artificially. The new man, the upstart, the parvenu has always been a subject of interest, and literature has analyzed him unendingly. Here then we are merely giving a more exact form to things that have long been perceived more or less vaguely. We noted a varying distribution of residues in the various social groupings, and chiefly in the higher and lower class. Such heterogeneousness is a fact perceived by the most superficial glance. Changes in Class I and Class II residues occurring within the two social strata have an important influence in determining the social equilibrium. They have been commonly observed by laymen under a special form, as changes in religious sentiments, so-called, in the higher stratum of society. It has often been noted that there were times when religious sentiments seemed to lose ground, others when they seemed to gain strength, and that such undulations correspond to the social movements of very considerable scope. The uniformity might be more exactly described by saying that in the higher stratum of society, Class II residues gradually lose in strength, until now and again they are reinforced by tides upwelling from the lower stratum. Religious sentiments were very feeble in the higher classes in Rome towards the end of the Republic, but they gained notably in strength thereafter. Through the rise to the higher classes of men from the lower, of foreigners that is, freedmen and others, whom the Roman Empire raised in station. They gained still further in intensity in the days of the decadent Roman Empire, when the government passed into the hands of a military plebs and a bureaucracy originating in the lower classes. That was a time when a predominance of Class II residues made itself manifest in a decadence in literature and in the arts and sciences, and in invasions by Oriental religions, and especially Christianity. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the Puritan Revolution in Cromwell's day in England, and the French Revolution in 1789 are examples of great religious tides originating in the lower classes and rising to engulf the skeptical higher classes. An instance in our day would be the United States of America, where this upward thrust of members of lower classes, strong in Class II residues, is very intense, and in that country one witnesses the rise of no end of strange and wholly unscientific religions, such as Christian Science, that are utterly at war with any sort of scientific thinking, and a mass of hypocritical laws for the enforcement of morality that are replicas of the laws of the European Middle Ages. The upper stratum of society, the elite, nominally contains certain groups of people, not always very sharply defined, that are called aristocracies. These are cases in which the majority of individuals belonging to such aristocracies actually possess the qualities requisite for remaining there. And then again, there are cases where considerable numbers of the individuals making up the class do not possess those requisites. Such people may occupy, more or less, important places in the governing elite, or they may be barred from it. In the beginning, military, religious, and commercial aristocracies and plutocracies, with a few exceptions not worth considering, must have constituted parts of the governing elite and sometimes have made up the whole of it. The victorious warrior, the prosperous merchant, the opulent plutocrat were men of such parts, each in his own field, as to be superior to the average individual. Under those circumstances, the label corresponded to an actual capacity. But, as time goes by, considerable, sometimes very considerable, differences arise between the capacity and the label, while on the other hand, certain aristocracies originally figuring prominently in the rising elite end by constituting an insignificant element in it. That has happened especially to military aristocracies. Aristocracies do not last. Whatever the causes, it is an incontestable fact that after a certain length of time they pass away. History is a graveyard of aristocracies. The Athenian people was an aristocracy as compared with the remainder of a population of resident aliens and slaves. It vanished without leaving any descent. The various aristocracies of Rome vanished in their time. So did the aristocracies of the barbarians. Where in France are the descendants of the Frankish conquerors? The genealogies of the English nobility have been very exactly kept, and they show that very few families still remain to claim descent from the comrades of William the Conqueror. The rest have vanished. In Germany, the aristocracy of the present day is very largely made up of descendants of vassals of the old lords. The populations of European countries have increased enormously during the past few centuries. It is as certain can be that the aristocracies have not increased in proportion. They decay not in numbers only. They decay also in quality, in the sense that they lose their vigor, and that there is a decline in the proportions of the residues which enabled them to win their power and hold it. The governing class is restored not only in numbers, but, that is the more important thing, in quality, by families rising from the lower classes and bringing with them the vigor and the proportion of residues necessary for keeping themselves in power. It is also restored by the loss of its more degenerate members. If one of those movements comes to an end, or worse still, if they both come to an end, the governing class crashes to ruin and often sweeps the whole of a nation along with it. Potent cause of disturbance in the equilibrium is the accumulation of superior elements in the lower classes and conversely of inferior elements in the higher classes. If human aristocracies were like thoroughbreds among animals, which reproduce themselves over long periods of time with approximately the same traits, the history of the human race would be something altogether different from the history we know. In virtue of class circulation, the governing elite is always in a state of slow and continuous transformation. It flows on like a river, never being today what it was yesterday. From time to time, sudden and violent disturbances occur. There is a flood, the river overflows its banks. Afterwards, the new governing elite again resumes its slow transformation. The flood has subsided, the river is again flowing normally on its wonted bed. Revolutions come about through the accumulations in the higher strata of society, either because of a slowing down in class circulation or from other causes, of decadent elements no longer possessing the residues suitable for keeping them in power, and shrinking from the use of force, which meantime in the lower strata of society elements of superior quality are coming to the fore, possessing residues suitable for exercising the functions of government and willing enough to use force. In general, in revolutions, the members of the lower strata are captained by leaders from the higher strata because the latter possess the intellectual qualities required for outlining a tactic, while lacking the combative residues supplied by the individuals from the lower strata. Violent movements take place by fits and starts, and effects therefore do not follow immediately on their causes. After a governing class or a nation has maintained itself for long periods of time on force and acquired great wealth, it may subsist for some time still without using force, buying off its adversaries and paying not only in gold but also in terms of the dignity and respect that it had formerly enjoyed and which constitute, as it were, a capital. In the first stages of decline, power is maintained by bargainings and concessions, and people are so deceived into thinking that policy can be carried on indefinitely. So the decadent Roman Empire bought peace of the barbarians with money and honors. So Louis XVI in France, squandering in a very short time his ancestral inheritance of love, respect, and almost religious reverence for the monarchy, managed, by making repeated concessions, to be the king of the Revolution. So the English aristocracy managed to prolong its term of power in the second half of the 19th century, down to the dawn of its decadence, which was heralded by the Parliament Bill in the first years of the 20th. Suppose we put in one category, which we may call S, individuals whose incomes are essentially variable and depend upon the person's wide awakeness in discovering sources of gain. In that group, generally speaking and disregarding exceptions, will be found those promoters of enterprise, those entrepreneurs, whom we were considering some pages back, and with them will be stockholders in industrial and commercial corporations, but not bondholders, who will more fittingly be placed in our group next following. Then will come owners of real estate in cities where building speculation is rife, and also landowners, on a similar condition that there be speculation in the lands about them. and then stock exchange speculators and bankers who make money on governmental, industrial, and commercial loans. We might further add all persons depending on such people: lawyers, engineers, politicians, working people, clerks, and deriving advantage from their operations. In a word, we are putting together all persons who directly or indirectly speculate and in one way or another manage to increase their incomes by ingeniously taking advantage of circumstances. And let us put into another category, which we may call R, persons who have fixed or virtually fixed incomes, not depending to any great extent on ingenious combinations that may be conceived by an active mind. In this category, roughly, will be found persons who have savings and have deposited them in savings banks or invested them in life annuities. Then people living on incomes from government bonds, certificates of the funded debt, corporation bonds or other securities with fixed interest rates. Then owners of real estate and lands in places where there is no speculation. Then farmers, working people, clerks, depending on such persons and in no way depending upon speculators. In a word, we so group together here all persons who neither directly nor indirectly depend on speculation and who have incomes that are fixed or virtually fixed, or at least are but slightly variable. Just to be rid of the inconvenience of using mere letters of the alphabet, suppose we use the term speculators for members of category S and the French term rentiers for members of the category R. Within the two groups of persons we shall find analogous conflicts, economic and social, between them. In the speculator group, Class I residues predominate. In the rentier group, Class II residues. That should be the case is readily understandable. A person of pronounced capacity for economic combination is not satisfied with a fixed income, often a very small one. He wants to earn more, and if he finds a favorable opportunity, he moves into the S category. The two groups perform functions of differing utility in society. The S group is primarily responsible for change, for economic and social progress. The R group, instead, is a powerful element in stability, and in many cases counteracts the dangers attending the adventurous capers of the S's. A society in which R's almost exclusively predominate remains stationary and, as it were, crystallized. A society in which S's predominate lacks stability, lives in a state of shaky equilibrium that may be upset by a slight accident from within or from without. Members of the R group must not be mistaken for conservatives, nor members of the S group for progressives, innovators, or revolutionaries. They may have points in common with such, but there is no identity. They are evolutions, revolutions, innovations that the R's support, especially movements tending to restore the ruling classes certain residues of group persistence that it had banished by the S's. A revolution may be made against the S's. A revolution of that type founded the Roman Empire, and such, to some extent, was the revolution known as the Protestant Reformation. Then, too, for the very reason that sentiments of group persistence are dominant in them, the R's may be so blinded by sentiment as to act against their own interests. They readily allow themselves to be duped by anyone who takes them on side of sentiment, and time again they have been the artisans of their own ruin. If the old feudal lords, who were endowed with R traits in a very conspicuous degree, had not allowed themselves to be swept off their feet by a sum of sentiments in which religious enthusiasm was only one element, they would have seen at once that the Crusades were to be their ruin. In the 18th century, had the French nobility, living on income, and that part of the French bourgeoisie which was in the same situation, not succumbed to the lure of humanitarian sentiments, they would not have prepared the ground for the revolution that was to be their undoing. Not a few among the victims of the guillotine had for long years been continually, patiently, artfully grinding the blade that was to cut off their heads. In our day, those among the R's who are known as intellectuals are following in the footprints of the French nobles of the 18th century and are working with all their might to encompass the ruin of their own class. Nor are the categories of R and S to be confused with groupings that might be made according to economic occupation. There again we find points of contact, but not full coincidence. A retail merchant often belongs to the R group, and a wholesale merchant too, but the wholesaler will more likely belong to the S group. Sometimes one same enterprise may change in character. An individual of the S-type founds an industry as a result of fortunate speculations. When it yields or seems to be yielding a good return, he changes it into a corporation, retires from business, and passes over into the R group. A large number of stockholders in the new concern are also Rs, the ones who bought stock when they thought they were buying a sure thing. If they are not mistaken, the business changes in character, moving over from the S-type to the R-type. But in many cases, the best speculation the founder ever made was in changing his business to a corporation. It is soon in jeopardy, with the R standing in line to pay for the broken crockery. There is no better business in this world than the business of fleecing the lambs, of exploiting the inexperience, the ingenuousness, the passions of the Rs. In our society, the fortunes of many, many wealthy individuals have no other foundation. The differing relative proportions in which S-types and R-types are combined in the governing class correspond to differing types of civilization, and to such proportions are among the principal traits that have to be considered in social heterogeneity. Going back, for instance, to the protectionist cycle, we may say that in modern democratic countries, industrial protection increases the proportion of S's in the governing class. That increase, in turn, serves to intensify protection, and the process would go on indefinitely if counterforces did not come into play to check it. This has been a reading of The Circulation of Elites by Vilfredo Pareto. It was published in English by Arthur Livingston and translated by Arthur Livingston and Andrew Bongiorno. My name is Didymus.